Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 4 of Studium, an arts and humanities podcast. I'm John Sozak. In this extended episode, we feature a very special conversation between our own Dr. Matt Waggoner, professor of philosophy at Albertus Magnus College, and Mr. David Roberts, writer and host of Volts, a podcast about the technology, politics, and policy of decarbonization, of reducing the amount of carbon in our atmosphere and fighting climate change. For 20 years, David has been a nationally recognized voice on climate change, clean energy, and the politics of both. He's a former staff writer with Vox and Grist, and his work has been featured in the Chicago Tribune, Reuters, and The Atlantic. He's made appearances on CNN and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. We bring you this conversation with David here on Studium, though, because of how effectively he has put into action his training in the humanities. David holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from Maryville College in Tennessee and a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Montana. In his conversation with Matt Waggoner, David describes how his training in these fields led to his career as a writer and podcaster, and how the skills he learned in the humanities enable him to do what he does every day. Matt and David begin by talking about David's studies, his early career, and how the philosophy of pragmatism, in particular, in the work of William James, John Dewey, and Richard Rorty, motivated his move into political writing. They go on to explore the importance of systems thinking, not just personalities, the political history of climate change, and the relative roles in politics of reason on the one hand and of power on the other. And they don't hesitate to get into the political weeds, tackling a range of very interesting practical questions. How can changing material conditions lead to new ways of thinking? How do you actually build a constituency willing to fight for change? And what are the benefits of walkable cities compared to cities built for cars? Both Matt and David show in this conversation how training in the humanities can hit the ground and enable us to make a real difference in our world. We are pleased to bring you this conversation between Dr. Matt Waggoner and Mr. David Roberts.
Hi, David.
Hello there.
Thanks for being here. So the sort of conceit of this whole conversation is the fact that you studied literature. I think British literature is what it says in LinkedIn.
Does it?
Yeah.
British literature?
It says British and Commonwealth.
What? I don't know how LinkedIn, I don't know where LinkedIn is getting its information.
Okay, so that was auto-populated. We'll dive into that.
I got an undergrad degree in English literature, which just meant literature, and minors in philosophy and religion in undergrad.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, so you did that in undergrad in Maryville, which is Tennessee. That's where you're from, I take it.
Yes, born and raised in Tennessee, in a small town in Tennessee, and then went to college in another small town in Tennessee, Maryville College, which no one has ever heard of. And then, when I graduated, I fled Tennessee literally the day after I graduated, never to return, and went out west to Montana, where from whence I applied to a variety of grad schools. I wanted to go to grad school in philosophy. In retrospect, applied to a bunch of grad schools that I had 0.0 chance of getting into. Got a bunch of rejection letters, spent a year drifting around, and then the following year applied to University of Montana, which is in Missoula, Montana, their philosophy program, which was a terminal master's program, not what you'd call a world famous philosophy program, but that I got into. So that's where I got my master's in philosophy.
Yeah, okay, so you did the master's in philosophy. Yeah, and so I mean, so there's that, but then there's the fact that what I've learned from you is about like grid, transmission grid infrastructures, RTOs, ISOs, like EV battery chemical structures, NCAs, LFPs, all about the IRA bill, all about the EPA Supreme Court decision,
Yeah.
CH4, N2O, CO2. So that's the
Interesting.
conceit of this conversation, is that you have this background in literature and philosophy, and then you're doing the stuff that you do now, which is remarkable, and it's been super interesting to me. And so we'll get to sort of the transition to what you do now, but I wanted to start with your educational background. What was the stuff that like interested you? Did you have particular focus in both the undergrad and the master's degree program?
Oh, I should mention that from the master's program, I then also applied to a bunch of schools for a PhD. Applied to a bunch of schools I had no chance of getting into, and ended up going to the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, the northernmost major city in North America, uh, where I studied for 1 year and then got a close enough look at academic philosophy, my future, that I pulled the ripcord and bailed out of the whole thing. So the shortcut for that is that I'm ABD. I'm part of the ABD tribe. I never did my dissertation or any of that, but I did a little bit of PhD study. And yeah, I kind of started out when I was young as in sort of getting into analytic philosophy. It sort of appealed to me when I was younger, and then as I read more philosophy and did more work, I drifted over to the American pragmatists. That's where I sort of ended up. My whole and then I was really interested in cognitive science, in brain stuff and consciousness, that whole nest of issues, and I wanted to bring those together, a sort of American pragmatist approach to cognitive science, and then try to derive some kind of ethics out of that. Try to derive some sort of ethics that didn't require anything supernatural, sort of a naturalist. I believe that was my master's thesis. I wrote a master's thesis. It's something about ethical naturalism and pursuit of ethical naturalism or something like that. I barely remember. So it was that cluster of things, but the approach of the American pragmatists in that whole kind of that whole way of thinking. That's kind of where I ended up and what I took out of school and took into the real world. I sort of, this sounds self-glorifying. I don't mean it to, but I sort of followed the same path Richard Rorty followed, which is he sort of thought his way out of philosophy. He's like, wait a minute, if I take what I'm saying seriously, what am I doing in academic philosophy, right? I need to go out into the world. And I sort of felt the same way. I ended up quite quite sort of suspicious and deflationary toward grand thinking, grand concepts, grand metaphysical theories, and very much in the mode of it's procedure and process and how we live that matters, and not these grandiose ideas. And so it's sort of, as Rorty said, if you arrive there, you're like, well, what am I doing in philosophy? There's no point. These are not answerable questions. Nothing rides on the answer to these questions. The real questions that matter are much more tangible, much more earthly, much more about how humans actually are and behave in the world. And if you want to know about that, you don't sit in a room thinking. Right? You go out into the world and investigate the actual world. So that's what I did. So that's what my philosophical route out of philosophy.
Was through Richard Rorty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in part.
Yeah, I mean, Richard Rorty strikes me as one of those people who, first of all, is like one of the smartest philosophers of the 20th century, and also kind of bucked the trend in terms of being one of the clearest writers
Yes,
and really kind of bringing things down to earth.
yes, I loved that about him. Like to me, what I primarily got out of philosophy, and I think, this is the same thing Rorty said, is just, being trained to think about systems and how they hang together and how the parts relate to one another and what follows from your premises, just to sort of think systematically. But like once you have learned to do that, you know, take it into the world and use it to make the world better. Don't just sit thinking systematically forever and writing increasingly abstruse papers about it. That's why I liked Rorty, like Rorty's last book about politics. I loved, and that's sort of like what I got into also is like, let's put our thinking caps on and go out into the world and think about politics and think about how people relate to one another and think about how to actually make the world better. And this is, this all comes back to the ethics too, is I sort of, I realized that a pragmatic approach to ethics is not, you're not, sort of seeking or thinking about what is the good, capital T, capital G, sort of in the abstract, or like how people ought to be in the abstract. You're thinking about what are humans like and how can we lead actual humans to behave in more ethical ways? And if you and that's not an abstract thing. To understand that, you got to go actually study the humans and study the systems that they live in, and think about how to tweak those systems to guide them in a better direction. And that's all. Philosophy is not going to get you any of that. Like you got to go out and like into the world and see and figure out how the world works. So it was my sort of interest in ethics too that also kind of led me out of philosophy into, psychology and sociology and politics and all these things. It's like how making actual, making systems in which elicit more ethical behavior is a very turns out to be a very hands-on thing that hinges on the shape of the world, the actual nature of the world, and not any sort of abstract, abstract
Yeah.
concepts.
The other word that comes to mind for me is absolutism. I mean, I think pragmatism was one of a cluster of 20th century philosophy movements that was trying to shift away from any sort of absolutism. But some of the other movements kind of went off in the direction of like semiotics or language or discourse or um, you know a lot of different things. Pragmatism was kind of like the I mean, it was like the American philosophy as opposed
Yes,
to the stuff happening
I
in
love
Europe.
James. James is I mean, in terms of, especially just in terms of writing, just the actual writing itself. I love James. I love yeah, it's sort of a practical American attitude. Like, I flirted around with some of the sort of postmodern stuff, and some of that appeals to me. But I got some of the same feeling from that as after I read it for a while as I got from the other stuff, which is like we're drifting off into, we're just drifting off into the thinkosphere. And this is sort of the value of pragmatism to me is it drags you back. Like, what does this matter in terms of the actual course of human affairs? What does it matter? And this is sort of where we get truth value. Like truth is the thing that works, that works to help you navigate the world. And so it's helpful, I think, some of that postmodern thinking in helping you realize that a lot of things that seem real and tangible are in fact social constructs, and that you know and that in some sense our shared reality is a social construct, and that's fine, but like what follows from that? Not much. You still got to get there in the social construct and get your hands dirty and try to improve it, right? Like it's whether it's real in some metaphysical sense or only a social construct in some other metaphysical sense. Either way, you got to get down in it, get your hands in it, and try to make it better, right? Like so, and again, it sort of leads you to these sort of distinctions that this is the sort of pragmatic way of thinking. Like, what do these distinctions matter? Like, what follows from them? That it's just a social construct doesn't really matter in any
Yeah.
tangible way. I feel the same way about, I wrote a post about this once about this sort of, it was when Elon Musk, I think, brought up this sort of idea that we're all living in a simulation, which is just Descartes. It's just the brain in the jar
Hmm.
all over again. And I
Hmm.
felt the same way about the simulation thing that I felt about the brain in the jar thing, which is who cares? What difference could it make, right? If I'm a brain in a jar, okay, I still the same stuff around me, still the same people around me. Like I still have to live a life. So what difference, practical difference could it make if I'm in a simulation? If it's literally impenetrable and everything is a simulation, then you're just thinking up a new word for everything and you still have all the same practical problems you had before. So yeah, this is it's that pragmatic thinking that I've tried to apply in my work.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So what I hear you saying is that like social constructionism was really big in the 80s, I think, at least in some fields. It took a while for people to sort of come around to the idea that you say that something or everything is a social construct doesn't mean that it's irrelevant or doesn't impinge on our lives. It is still the realities that we, live in. I mean, if race or gender or something is a social construct, they still impinge on our realities, still have to be
Yeah, I think
lived.
that I mean I think sort of broadly what I take away from that stuff, and this is sort of what I take away from skepticism more broadly as a philosophical movement, is just the practical takeaway from that stuff is humility, is intellectual humility, right? Like it nothing is fixed and permanent. Nothing is definitely like even the things I'm most sure of, I need to hold a space in my head. They call it, there's a term for it, negative capacity, I think. I just need to hold space in my head for the idea that this too might be just a collective mistake. So it's just and again, that takes me back to pragmatism. It's just a sort of holding all your beliefs at least some remove, and holding the idea in your head that they're all provisional, that you're just a tiny subjectivity in a vast universe, and you probably don't know as much as you think you do. And again, that's not about finding truth or what's real and what isn't. That's just about how you interact with the world, right? And this is what pragmatism, I think, drags you back to again and again, and what I try to drag my writing back to again and again, because these same dynamics come up in the subjects I cover. It's just back to procedure, back to process, back to how do I interact with the world? How do I behave in the world? And how do I put this sort of intellectual humility to work in the world and bring it to my work in the world? And that's sort of what all the sort of various flavors of skepticism and social constructionism and all that kind of stuff mean to me is just we're probably wrong about most of what we think. So just don't get attached. Don't get too attached. It's slightly Buddhist too, which I think,
Hmm.
somebody in the world should write a dissertation about that, about the consonance between pragmatism and Buddhism. But
Mm,
the idea of Buddhism is hold the world at somewhat removed. Do not get attached to any
mhm,
particular thing in the world because for all these reasons. So that's very tricky. There's a lot in the world. There's a lot in human personalities and psychology that needs and wants certitudes and fixed points. To it just We have an epistemic need for closure and certainty that is at odds with this notion of intellectual humility. So that's just a constant struggle, and that's just like, there's no answer to that. There's no final answer to that. It's just a day-to-day struggle to bring that into your life and your work.
yeah, I mean, you're dancing around. On the one hand, you don't want to overstate the confidence you can have in certainty. And so you want to be pragmatic. On the other hand, you don't want to give yourself over to nihilism and be like, there is nothing that actually matters, nothing that's
Exactly.
real. Yeah. I'm wondering, well, you were talking about Buddhism. I mean, even William James, famously wrote about world religions, the varieties of religious experience. He's very well aware of that. But like, seems to me like climate change has sort of changed the playing field in terms of some of the kind of eccentricities of philosophy and other humanities fields. I mean, because you know, there was a lot of this like social constructionism, and then the realities of climate change hit, and it's like, oh, here's this real thing. It's like actually going to mess things up, and it's got a definite timeline. So if you want to talk about that, you can, but we have realities we have to face.
Well, I mean, yes, in some sense. In some sense, if you believe in deconstructionism, then climate change is just another social construct. But again, like, what follows from that? You still got to reduce emissions. You're still going to burn up, right? Like
Yeah.
drought. All of it may be a social construct, but in the end, like if you're thirsty, you're thirsty. If you're hot, you're hot. I mean, climate change to me was, um, I don't want to say a wonderful discovery because it's terrible. But like when I started writing about environmental stuff, when I first got a job at Grist, this tiny, tiny little environmental publication online that I first got a job at, I didn't have any journalism experience and I didn't have any experience in environmentalism either. I was just utterly adrift and in need of a job and begged my way into that job.
You were good at winging it.
Yes, it's a life full of winging it. So when I started writing about this stuff, I was like, well, what should I write about? And like traditional environmental stuff is, like a factory polluted the water. The water is now hurting people. Tons of that stuff out there. And it's important, ethically important, politically important, but it's not that intellectually interesting. It's pretty straightforward what's going on, right? There's not a lot of, you don't have to think a lot about it. It's right there, and it's all just about power. It's just about marshaling the political power to push back against it. But climate change is so big that this is what I discovered as I started to get into it. There are a million practical difficulties in dealing with it, but there's also just this, it's just very difficult to think about. It's very difficult to cognize what is it? Like, what kind of thing is it? Just like, how do we think about it? How do we think about it in relation to human prosperity and human progress and history and the obligations of politics. Like it's a system of systems that touches everything, and that's the kind of thing that philosophers, right? That's what they teach you to do in philosophy is to try to wrap your mind around big systems of systems and how all the pieces hang together. And so it was a real like I was like, oh, like my training is actually useful here. Like, there's a lot of environmentalists out there, a lot of political types, a lot of political scientists, but philosophers can actually be helpful here. And ironically, kind of the my attempts to sort of help people think their way through this are much closer to what I envisioned and wanted out of philosophy than anything I could have found in
Mm.
academic philosophy, right? Like I feel like I'm now using the tools of philosophy in a way that actually helps people in the world, which is what I wanted out of philosophy and couldn't find in academic philosophy. But now, weirdly and ironically, I feel like I'm in a place where I'm actually doing, in some sense, applied philosophy among other things, sort of like helping people think this giant thing through. So it's sort of a happy meeting of subject matter and my needs at the time, despite the sort of dire nature of the problem.
I can see that in your work. I mean, for example, so the go-to stuff for people who have a concern about climate change is I'm going to recycle, I'm going to compost, or like some sort of eco consumption, some kind of individual behavior. And and then in your reporting, there we go. We have guests. We have
Pardon
multiple
pardon my
guests.
dog. Hang on a second. We might have a delivery.
That's all right. We can pause.
Sorry, she'll get over it.
Like one of the things that I was really impressed by was transmission week, which I think turns into transmission month. And there's like
Originally,
battery week,
last
which
week.
turns into battery month. And you're deep diving and drawing attention to the fact that if we are thinking in terms of scale and impact, we really do have to think in these systemic
Yeah.
ways, like about infrastructure and about the grid. And I can see how that's a kind of a concrete application of thinking systemically, but also pragmatically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that people I think have difficulty, just ordinary people are I think we're inclined for various reasons of our evolutionary machinery inclined to think in personal terms and in concrete personal terms, and it's often very difficult to think systemically. So, for instance, in politics, like poverty, people are inclined to think about poverty in terms of what is the behavior of the poor person and how does that lead to their poverty? Like, what is to think in terms of the person instead of thinking in terms of like what are the systems that led to this? Like, what are the infrastructural and political decisions that led to this? So that's part of what I do is constantly try to nudge and help people think in terms of systems and in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the larger questions. And this, of course, is incredibly true in climate change. Like this clash between systemic thinking and personal thinking plays out in climate change over and over again because people want to think in terms of personal, people want to think in terms of the personal and proximate. But in climate change, as you say, like a single person recycling and like carpooling is just absolutely trivial. It's absolutely 100% trivial relative to the scale of the problem. So the only way we can get at climate change is to think systemically. That's the only way we can solve the problem, is to change systems. So it's an interesting, again, it's like when we talk about applied philosophy, I was like, here's a place where where systemic thinking is a practical necessity. Like people have got to start thinking systemically. So that's like me to the battlements. Like, hey, systemic thinking. Like I do that. It's a weird, it all kind of fell in place in a weirdly lucky way. But yes, like, and I feel like, in a sense, thinking about climate change is a kind of gateway into systemic thinking, right? Like it's sort of forcing everybody to at least dabble in systemic thinking, sort of forcing everybody to think that way. And maybe they can take that into other areas. I hope so. But yeah, it's one area where this sort of inclination toward making personal, personal drama and personal choices just founders on climate change. It just doesn't work. It just can't find purchase. And that's been interesting to sort of try to help people through that.
Yeah. And then, of course, I mean, so philosophy helps you think systemically, but in dealing with a problem like climate change that has to be addressed socially and globally, that means you're also having to deal with um, if it's a systemic problem, it has to be dealt with collectively. And so then we get into all these kind of really difficult political um, problems, which you think about it. I mean, you're a journalist of clean energy and politics, which
Yeah,
is
politics is my sort of obsession with politics goes farther back than my obsession with climate and energy. I've been sort of interested in politics my whole life, but it's a real the last 15 years of writing about this, sort of intensively following it, has been a real education. A real education in politics, a very frustrating education in politics. And it's, part of it is, um, one thing that I think attracts people to philosophy is attraction to the notion that, sort of resolving disputes reason, via reasoned dialogue and persuasion. And I think people who go through humanities, not just philosophy, but humanities in general, sort of, are taught that that's the way things ought to be, and are attracted to that and love that notion. And then they take that out into politics and just get pantsed. just get beat up in the alley behind the building, just
yeah,
find out over and over and over and over again that is not how collective action works. It's not how politics works. Like a better argument and $1.50 will get you a cup of coffee, right? Like no one, there's no this is what I see people finding out over and over again as they come out of the humanities and into sort of progressive politics, is that there's no, you might have the better evidence and the better arguments, but there's no referee. There's nobody who can step in and say, "I'm calling this, you win," right? Like you have the better arguments and they don't acknowledge your better arguments, then there you are, right where you started, right? And ultimately, it reduces to power. Who has the power to implement their preferred solutions? Who has the power to push politicians one way or the other? Who has the money and the power to build a communications machine that can repeat its messages to people? Like what you find is even super dumb and obviously wrong things can catch on if they're repeated over and over and over again every time people turn on the TV or radio. This is what you find in politics writ large. I think throughout modern history is You have people coming out of the humanities into progressive politics, and then out of like business and trade schools into and like marketing into conservative politics. Sort of they learn business and marketing. That is the craft of how to sell things, right? Not is this the right thing to sell in some abstract ethical way, but just like here's your product, you need to sell it. How do you sell it? How do you basically manipulate people into buying it? It's manipulation, it's propaganda in the end. And you have people come out of humanities who sort of sniff at that and think, oh, I don't approve of propaganda. I don't want to use propaganda. I don't want to use tools that manipulate people. I want to persuade people via reason to come to my side of things. And so, consequently, all the tools of mass persuasion and manipulation are sort of being used by one side. And the other side is, I mean, this played out in climate change in such clear and painful fashion. I mean, the first probably 10 years of my career, now climate change has, I think, made a shift out of sort of abstract political argument and into, business and engineering and it's a much more practical thing now. Like we're finally underway dealing with it, in part because the tools that we need to deal with it have become cheap enough now that the economics are sort of making the argument for us. And but for the first 10 years I was in this, sort of like solar and wind were wildly expensive. And so the whole thing was sort of this abstract argument about climate change versus climate change deniers, right? And just the amount of time and energy and work and passion that all these people from the humanities and sciences put into crafting the best argument and like how can we persuade climate deniers, right? This was the central obsession of the climate community for years, and they came up with better and better arguments and better websites that had all the charts and graphs and the IPCC sort of came out of this as like this grand global synthesis of the like argument and evidence, this towering monument to evidence and argument, and to a first approximation, it didn't change a single denier mind, right? It turns out none of that had any effect whatsoever, right? Because if you are motivated by things core to your identity to deny climate change, right? That's the impetus for denying climate change, is that it clashes with your identity, which is deeper than argument, deeper than reason. And so the denialism wasn't derived from evidence and argument, right? And thus could not be dislodged by evidence and argument, right? We're dealing with deeper things than this. We're dealing with deep questions of identity. So, it took so long for the climate community to learn this. And still to this day, I hear people like, how can I persuade deniers? This is still a sort of preoccupation. Thankfully, not as much as it was, but like this was like the center of my life for years. And I spent years sort of like wading into comment sections, with my great arguments and my great citations and my great evidence, and seeing over and over again, like, oh, it's just not working on anyone. It's not changing anyone's mind. And so I gave up on it. But man, thousands of people of goodwill, thousands and thousands of hours spent banging heads against that wall to no effect whatsoever. And like to me, that was a very practical education in the limits of evidence and arguments and reason in the public square. Like again and again, you find you're in the comment section arguing back and forth, and you're thinking, my arguments are way better. My evidence is way better. But again, there's no referee. No one's going to step in and call the fight. There's no authority that can say, oh, your arguments are better. I'm calling this argument, you win. There's no referee, and so there's no end to the fight. And eventually you realize, like, maybe these people are wasting thousands and thousands of hours of labor from people of good faith on purpose. Maybe the whole point is to waste thousands and thousands of our hours of our time, and maybe we'd be better off just ignoring these people and going on with the practical work of solving climate change. And eventually the denier community will fade and shrink to where it has no real political strength and no one cares about it anymore, not because they're persuaded, right? But just because practically the world has moved on and they have no purchase and they have no point and they're not doing anything pragmatically useful for their side, right? Like, it's in the end, it's not argument that's ever going to settle it. So that's another way that diving into climate change gave me a real education in being pragmatic, like what works, what shifts actual things in the world, like what changes actual systems, redirects the flow of money, produces good technology, like what actually works to change the world itself. And it turns out reason, reason and persuasion are fairly marginal in that pursuit. Sorry to say
Yeah.
this, to all you philosophy students.
Yeah, so I detect some disillusionment with, I mean, reason is like sort of the core of philosophy. It's what we're all about, like trying to make a rational argument, and you're up against rhetoric and a media industry that promotes rhetoric over reason.
Well, this is
Um,
this is the this to me is Rorty's insight is if your ultimate goal is to make the world better, right? And you are devoted to reason, you will, in the course of reasoning about how to make the world better, you will reason yourself away from reason, away from philosophy. I mean, if you really follow the trail and follow the reason and aren't just devoted to this as a sort of aesthetic pursuit and it's something you just love doing, like you will, like, it's reason that eventually reveals to you that reason and persuasion are not particularly effective tools for changing the world, right? It's reason that leads you there. It's reason that leads you away from reason, at least as a tool for pursuing your ultimate end, which is making the world a better place.
yeah, and in a way, this is a summary of pragmatism. I mean, I can see, I before you mentioned recently in writing or on a podcast that you'd studied philosophy. And I'd been following your work for a little while, and that sort of perked up my ears. And I thought to myself, after like looking at your work, I thought he studied pragmatism. Like, this is clear, especially like I wanted to talk to you about carbon pricing and the economist's approach to all this. Reading your work on that, it's like very clear that your approach is, especially when we get into any kind of like political stuff, it's very um, pragmatic.
I don't know if you ever found it, but last year, one of the first posts I ever wrote for Volt when I started my own newsletter was it was kind of about the trolley problem and trying to explain, um, why I'm a, a political liberal, uh, and how I approach the trolley problem. It was one of the few sort of explicitly kind of philosophical posts I wrote, and it as you can imagine, I was extremely skeptical and deflationary toward the trolley problem. To me, the trolley problem is a perfect example of philosophy abstracting itself you know, to the illusion that it's getting to the core of the question, right? But in doing so, actually abstracts away from anything that matters in the world. And so, like, my whole point was like, in any real world trolley problem, it would be the tangible details that actually matter, like the age of the track, like will the lever work, like what is the personal history and disposition of the person holding the lever, like who put the people, like all these details that you abstract away from in philosophy turn out to be in the real world the things that matter. And so if you want people to behave ethically, what matters is not training them on these super abstract concepts, but much more mundane details of trying to stay calm and be somewhat reflective and like get a good night's sleep. Like it turns out if you want people to like behave well, feeding them well and making sure they're well rested has a ton more to do with them behaving well than any knowledge they might have about abstract, what's right in the abstract. You know what I mean? It's
Mhm.
always the real world that we end up back in that matters. So yeah, that was, if anybody wants to know, sort of why I'm sort of pragmatic in my approach, that's a good post to return to.
Your at the time that we're recording this, your most recent episode was great. And you talked to, I think his name's John Jost at NYU,
Jost, I learned.
Jost, and he's done work on system justification. And it's kind of about like how we get set in these kind of ideological ways. You framed it in terms of like social change and sort of the difficulties of social change because we get in these ideological positions. It's very hard to get out of them. I mean, in terms of like the way in which philosophy serves you well and what you do now, obviously it's the ability to write and think critically, but I would also say close reading because Jost remarked, I think twice in that conversation, that your summaries of his books were perfect, better than he could have summarized them himself.
Well,
But that was like a high level conversation that I thought was really interesting.
reading, yes, like close reading, it's hilarious. Like that's what I was doing in school, and it just turns out to be what I'm doing with my whole life, like reading things and writing reports on them at the last minute.
Yeah. And explaining them. You're an
Cramming,
explanatory journalist.
cramming and then explaining. Yeah, it turns out you can make a whole life out of that. It's not just in school. You can do that for a living. But yeah, that's just another reinforcement of what I was saying before, is like what Jost has discovered through experiments, through empirical research, is that um, people don't want to think systemically, and people are inclined, like even if they are living in systems that abuse them, systems that characterize them as lesser, systems that leave them poor and subject to random use of the force of the state, like systems that are not good for them. Even those people will tend to defend that system, justify that system in their head. And this is another thing where you look at sort of philosophy and reason and persuasion. You can go to someone and say, look, the evidence shows, if you follow the evidence through reason, it will show that the system you're in is bad for you and you ought to be against it, right? You ought to be pushing back against it. That's very difficult. People are very, very strongly psychologically inclined to justify the systems in which they're involved. And part of that has to do with, this epistemic need. Like people would rather know something and be certain of where they are and how they fit in, even if they're on the ass end of it, than not know. Like not know what's right, not know what system is good and true, to be without, to not know where you fit in the world, like uncertainty. This is what I realize. Like people, especially people, and Jost's other book is about the differences between conservatives and liberals, and sort of one of the things that marks conservatives is a more, just on a very basic brainstem level, a heightened sensitivity to threat, basically, like more fear. It's fear that is everything. But people are terrified of uncertainty and ambiguity and not knowing how the world works and how they fit into it, and would prefer to believe in a system that they're on the ass end of than to not know what to believe, basically. Like that's so that's the epistemic need for system justification that Jost has found over and over again. So this just once again shows you like the limits of reason and persuasion. You're dealing with psychological forces that are prior to any use of your frontal cortex, right? Like, that are prior to and stronger than anything your frontal cortex can do with reason and symbol manipulation and all that kind of thing. So it just returns you again to sort of, it's less about how to persuade people and more about how can I change material conditions so that the next generation of people are less sensitive to threat, more open to new experience, right? More tolerant of delaying cognitive closure. So these are all the typical psychological measures, and people fall along this spectrum. And it turns out that we have a pretty good knowledge of what produces people with hypersensitivity to threat. Basically, like what produces small c conservative people. And that goes everything from, is the mother breathing air pollution when she's pregnant? Right? Like, what is the nature of her prenatal care? What's the nature of her postnatal care? Is the baby um, taken care of? Does the baby feel safe in those crucial early few months where your brain is forming? Right? All those things, none of those things have to do with argument or persuasion. The baby is not even capable of speaking yet when a lot of those things get determined. So if you want people who are more capable of empathy and open-mindedness and openness to experience, you don't go out and argue with people. You go and improve prenatal care, right? You try to produce better and more open-minded people, right? And that's all. And that again is like leading you. That's your reason leading you back into the world. It turns out that it's the world that matters. It turns out it's like, do we have, um, uh, do we allow parents to take time off when their kids are born, right? Like that turns out to be hugely determinative in what kind of people you end up producing. And that has nothing to do with reason. It's what are the material conditions of their development, right? So again, it's like leading you back to pragmatics, leading you back to sort of like, what is the policy? What are the material conditions here? It's not reason and persuasion that get you there. It's a lot of that stuff is just fixed by the time you're even aware of yourself as an autonomous reasoning agent. A lot of that stuff is just already baked in, right, into your neural machinery, and it takes enormous self-reflection and effort and sort of like therapy or psychedelics or whatever to like get back to that deep level and change those things. It's very difficult to change those things once they're kind of baked in. So, this is another area where I sort of like system justification is just how people, a reflection of people's uh, fear of sort of not knowing things and the sort of existential fear of not being safe. Like being part of a social system, even if you're on the ass end of it, is safer generally than being outcast outside it alone, right? So there's this epistemic need for closure, there's this existential need for safety, and then there's this relational needs of like, if you want to fit in with the people around you, you sort of accept the system they're all part of, right? And if you reject it, you become an kind of an outcast, right? Again, which is, and people have a very deep need for like to to fit in and be accepted and be and to belong with their social groups. You have these relational needs too. So you have all these psychological needs that push you toward justifying the system you're involved in. And getting someone to think outside that, to sort of kind of transcend that and look at that from the outside and assess the system from some sort of objective third person perspective is just very, very, very difficult and tends to sort
Hmm.
of founder on basic psychological needs. Like it's just not, you come out of the humanities and you think, oh, everybody loves reason and argument. Like this is how people make up their mind about things. It just isn't.
Yeah. So the answer isn't syllogisms. It's more it's social support programs, like
Yes,
provide for people's
exactly. Social
needs.
welfare
Yeah.
programs. Yeah, it's pedestrian stuff. It's like making sure that like in these Scandinavian countries, when a woman gives birth, a nurse comes every couple days in the beginning and every week, and then sort of monthly later on, just to make sure, like, do you know how to swaddle and care for this child? Do you know how to feed this child? Do you know how the basics of like
Hmm.
child rearing? And it turns out like that's very pedestrian hands-on stuff, but that makes an enormous difference in the long-term health of those children. And here in the US, we just don't. We don't
Hmm.
let people take off before birth. We don't have any policies that let people take off time after. Certainly not fathers, and only a tiny bit for mothers. And we don't send nurses to their houses, and we're just left on their own. And so kids in that very early stage when their basic neural machinery is being formed experience anxiety and privation, and that shapes their
Yeah.
and so this is why you end up with Scandinavian societies where you have high social trust. You have high sort of just basic levels of like, I trust the people around me, that we're all involved in a common undertaking, and so they trust government more and they trust social systems more. And in the U.S., you have this very, very low level of social trust and declining social trust, where we don't trust the people around us, and so we are all constantly thinking about how can I buy the bigger, more up armored car? How can I get a bigger house farther away from other people? Like how can I build my private kingdom to be safe in my private kingdom? Because we don't trust the social sphere. We don't have
Yeah.
that mutual trust. And part of that is culture, part of that is history, part of that is, of course, like racism and slavery, our history with slavery and all that. But part of it is also just we don't make any effort to ensure that kids are healthy in those crucial years. And so we come out with this sort of neural machinery that's prone to fear and mistrust. It's all, mutually reinforcing cycle, but all of that
Hmm.
is, none of that is changed by reason and persuasion. All of it is changed by basically material circumstances and policies and very practical stuff.
Yeah. All forms of insecurity. I mean, emotional, physical, food insecurity, housing insecurity. Um, and in addition to the lack of social supports, there's a kind of manufacturing of fear and anxiety.
Sure.
Sometimes capitalizing on real events like the Cold War and 9/11, or if you don't have one of those, then you talk about immigrants or something like that. One
If
of the
if
things I
you want
wanted
high
to kind
social
of
trust,
pivot. Oh, go ahead.
if you want high social trust and egalitarianism and sort of pluralism and equality, you need people to be using their frontal cortex. You need people to feel safe on that basic brainstem level so that they can think on this higher level. Conversely, if you don't want egalitarianism, if you want to preserve existing hierarchies, you need people to be fearful. You need to activate that brainstem fear, which is why everywhere you look across the world, conservative politics is all about stoking fear and mistrust. That is the basic,
Mhm.
this is the tool of conservative politics is the more scared you make people, the more small c conservative they become, and the more they're likely to vote for some sort of strongman that promises them safety, right? I mean, it's a very
Mhm.
mutually reinforcing cycle, and it's very difficult, as we are seeing around us every day. It's very difficult to reverse that cycle once it's started going, and you see it in the US, like more fear, more mistrust, more violence, more conservatives, more eh, conservatives, which then destroy the social programs that might work against this, leaving people even more fearful and even more conservative. Like this is the sort of cycle we see going on around us.
Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to talk to you about was politics, kind of in a broad sense, including policy and stuff like that. But in at least one of the episodes that I listened to with you, you talked about, you said something to the effect that I'm summarizing here, but like, these are the things I care about. It was like, I want people to have decent lives, to live healthy, equitable, satisfied, fulfilled, blah, blah, blah. And I was wondering if it was like a conscious thing on your part to be like, no, these are the values that I have. These are the things I believe in, my core concerns, as opposed to kind of coming out of the gate with labels. I know you also identify as progressive, but I really like that you sort of laid out, like, here's 5 things I care about. This is what motivates me in everything I do.
Yeah, I think, you know, intellectually and practically, the preferred way, the best way of going about things is to be firm in your values, in your ends, what you're aiming for, and flexible and open-minded in your means, right? And what you see happening over and over again in politics is people getting attached to the means and starting to define their identity through the means, and it just becomes it's sort of getting fixed, getting stuck. And so and so I'm constantly thinking about, like, what is the outcome that I'm after, right? What do I want in the end? I want a society with high social trust, with safety, where everyone's taken care of, with pluralism, where everyone is valued and no one is defined as lesser than anyone else, and rule of law that applies to everyone equally. These kind of basic outcomes. And so the question of how to get there, I try to, and I'm making myself out as some sort of intellectual hero. Like I fail at this all the time, just like everybody else. But I try to be flexible about how to get there, and I try to be sort of like, if one of my favorite policies, if one of my favorite means, if someone can mount a good argument that it's not working the way I think it's working, or that it won't work, then I try to be open enough that I can let it go. That I can be open to reason and persuasion myself about the best ways of achieving my ends. So, and I think that's just like good intellectual protocol for everyone to periodically do, just like what am I after? What is the end state I'm after? What are my ultimate values? Um, and then am I defining my identity too narrowly? Am I attaching to particular policies or particular means of getting there in a way that is leaving me kind of rigid? And it's hard. It's hard. It's just intellectual self-care, intellectual hygiene. you know and it's difficult to do that, and that's why um, it's easier to do as part of a group of like-minded people who are helping one another do it, right? This is another thing that I really objected to in Western philosophy that I learned, is this notion that reason and rationality are things an individual does. And like being rational is something that you do sitting alone in a room, heroically thinking real hard. But like in actual fact, reason is not the default baseline for people. It is something they achieve rarely. And it's not something any individual can consistently do throughout their lives. It is a social undertaking. This is how science works, not through individuals sitting and thinking real hard. It's offering up results, and then others criticize the results, and then others criticize that. It is a group undertaking which collectively, hopefully, is moving in the direction of truth, but it's not something an individual does. So this is something I emphasize again and again, is insofar as we achieve, like look at the social practice of science. It is set up to achieve truth, but even the formalities of science, sort of peer review and like experimental replication and all these things, all these rules we have set up in science to try to counteract the individual propensity toward unreason, toward
Yeah.
bad reasoning, to compensate, sort of socially compensate for the flaws and failures and frailties of individual reason. Even that is beset with problems and often fails, and it falls far short of the ideal. But it's a social collective undertaking. Reason always is, reason and argument always is. It's not some. This is why I sort of bridle against this sort of trend you see these days of the kind of rationalist community, and the effective altruism and all the things that come out of this. It's sort of, they all seem to think that like rationality is something that basically like white guys do by thinking real hard,
Or by pulling up a data set and
yeah, yeah,
analyzing
yeah,
it.
or like it just falls out of the numbers, like it's something that you give the white guys produce the numbers and then reason from them to truth, and but
Mhm.
in fact, reason is always collective. It's always a collective undertaking and benefits from diversity. Like this is another thing I come back to again, is like we've often framed diversity as sort of like a moral good, an extra, sort of extra moral bonus. But like, in fact, diversity of thought and approach is crucial to the collective undertaking of reason and finding truth. And if your movement is almost entirely composed of like Ivy League educated, affluent white guys with beards, it's not just that like you need diversity as like to be more sort of morally righteous. You need diversity to do what you're trying to do better, right? You need diversity because it will help you overcome blind spots, the kind of blind spots that everyone has. Like this is the thing, is like these, everyone bridles, like these white guy bridles when you say this, but like everybody's got blind spots. Everybody has things, has propensities and weird, just like because of the way life has shaped you, everybody has propensity toward error in certain areas and blind spots in certain areas. And so that's what diversity can overcome. It's not that, like, if you bring in a black woman, she's going to be the heroic reasoner that the white guy wasn't, right? She's going to have her blind spots too and her flaws too. But if you put them together, they're more likely, you put them in conversation and mutual, make it mutual work, you're more likely to produce something good at the outcome, right? Because you're at least to some extent canceling out one another's blind spots and flaws. And that's the sort of so again, pragmatically, if you want to reason and experiment and find truth, reason your way towards greater truth, it's collective, and diversity serves that. That's the point of diversity, not some sort of like you get like a gold star, a moral gold star. Pragmatically, diversity matters. It matters in doing what you're trying to do more effectively.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's one of the blind spots of philosophy too, because it did at some point acquire this notion of like Descartes sitting in his study thinking thoughts, but it
He
began
was kind of
with,
the ultimate of that. Like, I'm going to
yeah,
find
but
truth by just thinking real hard.
yeah, just like squeeze out the thoughts. But it begins really with, the Socratic dialogues, like Plato in dialogue with other people, having a conversation, trying to work their way towards the truth. Sometimes they get there, sometimes they don't. Um, you seem very interested in this in relation. I mentioned like carbon pricing and your kind of critique of the economists who imagine like a perfectly efficient carbon market or a carbon tax or something like that. That like if it worked in a perfectly efficient way, it would scale up big enough to solve the problem. And your response to that is kind of like, yeah, but where's the political feasibility? Like you always kind of you're like Rorty, you like bring it back to earth and remind people that there's a political context in which these things have to happen. And you do the same thing, like your kind of journalism of the evolution and demise of Build Back Better and then the IRA was interesting in this respect too. I was really struck by seeing you on PBS NewsHour or something, and you were like, "It's a great bill. Like, take the win, people. This is a great bill. There was a lot of compromises in this bill. It doesn't have all the things that people wanted, but actually, if you look at it, this is a really great. You like the IRA bill, it seems like."
Yeah, it's to back up a little bit, like when I first got involved in thinking about climate change, I too was very attracted to carbon pricing, the notion of carbon pricing, because intellectually it's very satisfying. It's very like the idea that you pull this one lever, right? Raise the price of carbon, and that diffuses its way throughout the entire economy. And so you get the sort of entire economy working as one to move away from carbon, right? And you don't have to do anything else. You don't have to fiddle with the details of this industry or that industry or like figure out this type, like what does people in this profession think and what are they trained to do? All these sort of practical questions, or you can just wave them away. Just like, oh, I raise the price of carbon and the distributed economy, will do the rest. We'll figure out the rest. It's a very intellectually satisfying idea.
Right. It's elegant.
In theory, it's very elegant and wonderful. And that elegance is captivating to people. It was captivating to me, captivating to a lot of wonks, is captivating to a lot of wonks to this very day. But you sort of realize over time, like, it's very intellectually satisfying. It's a great idea, and it doesn't seem to ever happen. It doesn't seem to ever pass and be implemented. And so, why is that? And then when you start thinking about why, you start thinking about practicalities. Like, well, what are you doing? Is like you are imposing a rise in prices on literally everyone. On literally everyone. You are doing something that people don't like, right? Which is having their prices raised to literally everyone. And the benefits are sort of diffuse and emergent, right? It's like they do not attach to any particular person or faction. They sort of emerge organically throughout the entire economy. So, however intellectually satisfying that is, politically, what you're doing is making an enemy of everyone and having no friends, right? Because no one in particular benefits. Everyone, in some cosmic sense, benefits, but no one in particular benefits. And everyone in particular feels the pain of it. That is like exactly the inverse of a good political approach. Like a political approach that makes enemies of everyone and has no friends other than like cogitating wonks is doomed, right? So you have to think about the practicalities of how do you create constituencies who are going to fight for this? Like, how do you do that? You have to direct tangible, visible benefits to that constituency if you want them on your side. So, so it's you end up with if you follow this chain of reasoning, you end up with something like industrial policy. You end up with sort of like you have to deal with each industry on its own terms, right? And think about like where it is, what it needs, how its dynamics work. You end up back in the muck. You have to think about the muck. You have to think about the details and how the world actually works and what could actually change how the world works. And that requires sort of fine-grained intervention. Exactly the kind of stuff that like economists disdain, right?
Mhm.
You end up having to go in and deal with industries one by one. And this is sort of like collectively, I feel like the climate movement finally learned this, finally figured this out. And the fruits are in the IRA, are in the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's like from a sort of economist's view from the ivory tower, it's a mess of like interventions and subsidies and sort of like lever pulling and bribery in some cases, and it's like from a
Tradable tax credits.
yeah, all this stuff is way too messy for economists typically to love it, but it is extremely practical, right? It is going to move the dial on very specific technologies that we need more of in a very sort of practical and direct way by dumping money on them. So like it's almost all carrots and no sticks. That's not ideal policy, but it is
Mhm.
like dump money on technology X, and you are going to not only induce more of technology X, you are going to create a political constituency that benefits tangibly from climate policy. And therefore, the next time you have a go at this, the next time you try to do climate policy, you're going to have this constituency on your side, which gives you more political power, which enables you to do more ambitious climate policy next time, right? It's
And
all
that's, yeah.
very practical. It's all very sort of practical and tangible. And that's why I loved the IRA. I mean, in addition to just being a kind of a miracle, politically, a miracle that it passed at all, a miracle that it emerged from that mess of 50-50 Senate at all and passed at all. It turns out to pass and be pretty good. And so this is I found myself in a weird position, like temperamentally, typically, I'm not what you'd call an optimist. Like politically things seem dire to me, and like I spend half my time online sort of pounding the table about how bad things are getting and how we're drifting in a terrible direction and we're doomed and all this kind of stuff. So for me, temperamentally and professionally, it was a weird position to be in, to be like, a good thing happened. Everybody, a good thing happened. And it was weird. It was a real interesting psychological study of liberals too, which is like there is a certain kind of engaged liberal, an online liberal, who views happiness with great suspicion, verging on hostility, right? I found myself trying to persuade people to be happy about this, and and I was just thinking of, thinking like, why do I have to work so hard to make people feel happy? Like the good thing happened, they should feel happy. Happiness is good, right? But like
Yeah.
they just didn't want to, and I found myself in dialogue with people who were just sort of groping around trying to find reasons not to be happy about this. And I just kept thinking like, why are you trying to find reasons not to be happy about this? Like, what is
Yeah.
wrong with happiness? It's a real education and sort of the psychological propensities of, your typical sort of well-educated, highly engaged online liberal. Like, if we feel happy, it will, everybody will just declare mission accomplished and quit fighting, right? Like you hear that a lot. Like if we say this is great, everybody will be like, "Oh, the job's done," and quit fighting. And I just would respond to that like, point to an individual person who's done that. That's not, people don't do that. Like as a matter of fact, winning victories makes people feel good about the fight they're in and makes people want to engage more in that fight. Like winning victories energizes people. It doesn't drain their energy, it energizes them. Only from your weird, hyper educated, hyper liberal, hyper online perspective could you think that, like, only the imminent threat of doom can motivate people. Like, it's just, that's a misunderstanding of human psychology. The imminent doom demotivates people, causes people to disengage. It is the idea that you're in a fight that a bunch of other people are into, we're fighting together, and we're winning and making progress. That is what engages people. That's what motivates and energizes people. And so I just found myself out there like, look, people, we did a good thing. Like a good thing happened. And it was really bizarre how much resistance I met in that.
Yeah, you're sort of trained to like be like purely idealistic and never compromise on that, to not be pragmatic and to never,
As though it's more virtuous.
yeah,
Right.
that's right. And then also to never be happy because if you do, you're affirming some state of affairs or something. I mean, the IRA, you framed, I think, Build Back Better, um, and talked about IRA in terms of the SIJ, the standards, I think incentives and justice, environmental
Standards,
justice.
investments, and justice. Yeah.
Oh, investments, yeah. And the standards sort of, I understand, got dropped from the IRA. So there's a compromise there. But
Yeah.
there's a ton of investments that are going to, capital is going to be channeled into these new technologies, but also the environmental justice stuff. And it's a lot about infrastructure. So there's a couple of things there that I think have already come up. One is the interest in infrastructure, the investment in infrastructure. Infrastructure is by definition a collective
Hmm.
thing. And it's an investment in a recognition that, so many of the things that affect all of our lives are collective, whether we want to think of it that way or not. And
Yes.
this is a huge investment in the collective.
Yes.
And then also the environmental justice concerns, say whatever you want about the bill or whatever standards you have. The fact is, communities of color and poor communities are going to have cleaner air
Yes.
at the end of the day.
And in terms of the investments, several of the large investments, 40% is earmarked basically to go to vulnerable and impacted
Yeah,
communities. So
right.
a lot of the investment money is sort of channeled uh, to those communities too. So there's explicit environmental justice provisions, just channeling a bunch of money to those communities and setting up,
Yeah,
setting up more formal ways of of identifying and finding those communities so that they can be helped. And then also, a point I make frequently, the basic environmental justice point is that these frontline communities suffer disproportionately from almost all environmental harms, especially pollution. But the flip side of that is they benefit disproportionately anytime those problems are mediated, anytime pollution goes down, it is those communities that disproportionately benefit. So in a sense, any pollution reduction policy is implicitly also an environmental justice policy because it is going to disproportionately benefit
Yeah.
frontline communities. Of course, like environmental justice communities will tell you, environmental justice is not just about money and policies. It's also about procedure and policy. Who's at the table
Right.
designing?
Right.
There's a procedural justice element to
Hmm.
environmental justice, which has been violated over and over and over again
Yeah.
throughout history and again in the IRA. Like ultimately, like Joe Manchin decided he wanted
Mm.
a pipeline, shoved it in there, and that was that. Like the
Yeah.
communities impacted by those pipelines never had a say, never got a
Right.
seat at the table to talk about it. So I don't want to exaggerate. I'm not here to tell environmental justice communities, clap harder. Like there's plenty of legitimate things to protest and things to be upset about. But all that said, there's an enormous amount done for those communities in this bill.
Hmm. And they were brought in. I mean, Schumer made an effort, I think, from the beginning of the process to
Yeah, like
bring
the
in the
core,
unions, the
the
EJ
core of the
community.
bill, was sort of shaped and determined and written a long time ago. This is one of the weird things about Manchin's whole whatever he did. Like, you know, he he stripped all the other stuff out of the Build Back Better, and then finally said, "I'm not doing it at all." And then for some reason changed his mind and said, "I'm doing it." He changed it. He said, "I'm not going to do it at all." At which point Schumer and all the other Democrats went to him and said, "Write the bill you want. Like, just tell us, like, whatever you want, give us something." And he said, "No, no, 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 no." Could have had whatever policy he wanted. And then in the end, for whatever reasons of his ego, changed his mind, came back to the table, and then ended up just passing what had been written anyway. Like,
Hmm.
it turns out policy
Yeah.
wasn't, it turned out he didn't care that much about policy as such. He didn't do anything to the policy. So the core of the policy in the climate and energy policies in the IRA were written in a very collaborative, determined through a very collaborative process where a lot of different parts of the left came together in discussion. The environmental justice
Hmm.
community, those mainstream groups, the sort of industry groups, the renewable energy industry, like there was a lot of collaborative work to come with these policies, and then sort of expert staffers in the Senate put those policies on paper, and they're great. And Manchin largely never messed with them. So that's another
Hmm.
way that sort of like environmental justice is still in the bill because it was, put in a long time ago and basically like survived unmolested right through the end, which is part of what's miraculous. Like of all the weird twists and turns this took, like basically like most of the original climate and energy stuff survived and passed. Who knows why, but it's a good
Yeah.
thing.
I've been keeping track, as we kind of like come to a close, I've been keeping track of themes like pragmatism, paying attention to sort of collective stuff and infrastructure. And then also this issue of kind of like hope and happiness. I have such mixed feelings about the process of the IRA passing because, on the one hand, when I was watching it happen, I was happy to see how collaborative the process was of putting it together. They clearly brought in really good experts because they did a lot of smart stuff in the bill, and it did get passed. So, yay, I'm happy. On the other hand, it could have just as easily been tanked by Manchin, and I cannot rationally explain why he ended up miraculously at the end. So it's like, am I happy for irrational, like
I
for
mean,
reasons that were unexplainable?
everything in this is the everything in nothing in politics makes sense, right? These are
Yeah.
these the people who are doing this stuff. This is something you learn when you get up close and follow politics closely in the U.S. and really get to talk to the people involved. They're just people. They're just as like dumb and blinkered as everyone else. They have their own biases and obsessions just like everyone else. Like they don't have any secret info that you don't have. They don't have any, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? There's no sort of like cabal of people behind the scenes who really know what's going on and are pulling the strings. Everybody's winging it all the time. Everybody is winging it. And this bill just like people winged this way and that, and it happened like take the win. You know what I mean? It's totally irrational how it happened, but that's almost always how politics works.
Yeah.
Usually irrationality leading to negative results. So
Right. So take the
irrationality
win.
led to a positive result this one time. So
Yeah.
hallelujah.
Yeah. You sometimes talk about, at least this is my recollection, is that sometimes towards the end of your conversations, you ask people to sort of imagine a utopian scenario. um, and that's consistent with this conversation about hope and happiness. Didn't Rorty write a book about hope?
Yes, he
I
had
think he did, yeah.
he had much to say about feeling hope even when there is no reasoned basis for it, which is
Hope against hope.
a crucial skill these days.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I was going to talk to you about cities, and here's the question I'll end with. What is you're very interested in cities. Describe yourself as a city person, and some of your journalism and reporting and conversations are about cities. What does your utopian city look like? What is your ideal city?
Uh, Before I answer that, let me just preface with an observation about this. Like, we've been talking about how people do not tend to operate in politics on the basis of reason and evidence and tend to have very strong sort of personal feelings and personal identities that determine how they interact with politics, against which reason and evidence are all but impotent.
Hmm.
Nowhere is that true more than in cities and urbanism. What you find is like, just to take an example I was talking about on Twitter today, if you close down a street to cars, make it a pedestrian street, the businesses on that street benefit. This has been found empirically again and again and again and again, almost without exception, right? So, insofar as reason and evidence have any purchase whatsoever, every business in a city ought to be demanding that streets are closed to traffic so that they get more business. But instead, it's the opposite. No matter how often that empirical result is found, no matter how much the evidence piles up, when you go to propose closing a street to cars and making it a pedestrian street, the businesses object because they think they will lose business, because they think everyone drives to get
Mm.
to their business. And you can shovel evidence on top of those businesses until you are blue in the face, and it never seems to make a difference. It's the same fight every time. No one ever learns anything because there are these instincts, these intuitions that are just fixed and immune to evidence. And it's the same with trying to put in a bike lane, or any of these sort of trying to make communities more walkable, taking away parking, increasing density, faces the same objections every time and everywhere you do it. And evidence doesn't change that. It doesn't make it easier the next time, right? It's just like an object lesson over and over and over again in the limitations of evidence and reason to change people's minds. It's just a very existential thing. If you want people to appreciate lower car cities and more dense, livable cities, almost the only way to get them to appreciate it is to take them and put them in one for a while. Let them live it. Let them live it and experience it. And then, like a couple weeks in Barcelona, you come back to the US, you're like, oh, like I only experientially can I absorb this, what it means to have fewer cars and more people on the street. You just, no amount of explanation, no amount of talking, no amount of evidence can penetrate people. It is a very experiential thing, which makes it a
Mm.
vexing, it's very vexing as a public policy area, right? Because like no amount of evidence and reason ever make it easier. Like you're just fighting the same battle over and over and over again. So this is a real, like if you ever are a philosopher coming into public policy and you want an object lesson in the limitations of evidence and reason, go into urbanism. Go try to persuade a single family homeowner to allow you to take away some parking nearby them, and you will see the limitations of reason and evidence real quick. So to return to your question, sort of my utopian city is like, it's a city where the majority of people do not have a car because they do not need one. I hate cars. I hate cars and what they have done to cities and what they have done to land use and what they have done to us, what they have done to us psychologically, practically, everything. Basically, cities are a geometry problem. If everybody has their own freestanding, separate structure to live in, and everybody has their own car, you have to sprawl. You can't fit, right? You can't fit people into a city if everybody has that. So you've got to get rid of cars and you've got to have people living closer together. And therefore, you have to make it nice, right? You can't just, and this is the problem, is that people view, they get attached to what they have. We talked earlier about status quo bias, about system justification. People get attached to what they have and can only think of these things in terms of losing things, like losing my car, losing my parking that I rely on, losing my house that I love, and to sort of show them what they could get is very difficult. Like I said, like you kind of have to take them and show them a place. But like I would like a place where people live close together and mingle on the streets, and streets mostly belong to people and cyclists and people on wheels and walking, and services are nearby, walkable. Grocery is walkable. The doctor, the dentist is walkable. And because people live close together, they know one another. The dentist knows you. You live around the dentist, and crucially, you can grow old. This is something that's more on my mind, having turned 50 recently. You can age in place. Like it's barbaric how most Western countries treat old people. Like when you get old, if you're stranded out there in your single family home in a suburb and you lose the ability to drive, you're just screwed and lonely and isolated, right? I mean, so many, like the US is full of lonely old people. And lonely young people too, but like old people um, don't have communities that they can age in. And so they end up in special facilities, isolated, more or less only interacting with other old people. And ask old people whether they like that. They don't. They want to be around communities. They want to be around young people. They want to be useful in a community. They want to have a role in a community and still be needed and useful in a community. And if you have a community where they can walk and everything is in walking distance, and there is a community of people who are used to seeing them on the street, right? Like this thing when you're walking, you see one another on the street and you see the old people. And so if the old person doesn't show up for a day or two, there's a bunch of people around who will think, where did they go? Let's go check on them, right? There's like a community of care around them, and they can age in place and be part of a community in their old age, which is just so important and so lost in car-centric suburban development. It's just horrible for old people, and it's horrible for young people. Like one thing I emphasize over and over again is why, when you're talking to people in America, very frequently their best friends are friends they made in college, and their best memories are memories of college. And I constantly say, why is it that this happens? Why do you create these intense, lasting friendships in college and then very often make no new friends afterwards, right? Like this is tons and tons of people. If you survey Americans, basically don't know how to make new friends and end up basically just having the friends they made in college. And why is that? Because college is a tight, walkable community where you run into people frequently, spontaneously, without planning it. And if you study the sort of science of friendship, which I sort of dabbled in a couple of times for writing a couple of posts, you ask like researchers, psychologists, what produces friendship, right? If you just ask people, they'll think, like-minded people or people of the same race or, people that have XYZ in common. But it turns out the psychological research shows the number one producer of friendship, the number one indicator of friendship is what they call propinquity, i.e., being around. It's just whoever you're around. It's whoever you're around repeatedly. Whoever you run into repeatedly, spontaneously, eventually you develop friendships with. And so in college, we have this environment where you're just constantly, spontaneously running into people. And so you form friendships. And then we leave college and we go out to suburbs where you never spontaneously run into anyone. If you want to see someone, you have to plan it. You have to call, plan a dinner party, plan to meet in their backyard or whatever. And as we all know, as all us suburban adults know, it's just like life becomes a grind and you don't have time and you forget and you let your friendships sort of wither because there's nothing, they never just happen spontaneously. And if you live in a community with other people, lots of other people, where you share streets and mingle naturally and see each other naturally, there's just a lot more propinquity. You just run into people more often and form friendships more often later in life. And then you don't have to sort of like cling to your college friendships forever because you have propinquity with other people. So I mean,
Nice.
that's my utopia. It's not anything exotic. Like, go to Barcelona and look at their sort of super blocks where they've sort of excluded cars from a big area and given the streets over to people and just hang out. This is what I beg people to do. I mean, obviously, it's like a privileged thing. Not everyone can travel, et cetera, et cetera. But like, if you can, just go to a nice walkable city. Just go hang out in a Barcelona superblock for a couple of days and you'll just see and you'll feel like, oh, just there's like people around, just like I'm sipping a cafe on a street in my own neighborhood, seeing people I'm familiar with. And like, if I need something, I can walk and get it. And if I want to go to another super block, there's bike lanes and sheltered walking paths and I can get there and then enjoy that one, and sort of these connected super blocks, you sort of realize the little connected communities of people. It's just like returning to a way of life that, characterized humanity for 99.9% of our evolutionary time on this earth, which is like living in a relatively small band of people that a community of people, and like the car-centric suburban way of living is just anti-human. It encourages, like, if you live in a car-centric area, this is another. I'm sorry, I'm rambling on too long, but cities are my hot button thing right now. If you live in an area where you have to have a car to survive, and you're always in a car, that means every new person that comes to your community is a competitor for space on the
Mm.
roads, for parking at the Starbucks or street side parking. Every new person is an imposition on you. Every new person slightly degrades your quality of life. This is an essential feature of car-centric communities. This is why you have all these NIMBYs, right? If you live a car-centric life, it really is a pain in the ass for a bunch of new people to move in because it's just a bunch of new cars. They're just traffic. New people are traffic. They're traffic and they're stealing your parking, right? So if you're in a car-centric community, you are over time naturally going to become hostile to people coming into your community. Whereas if you live in a nice walkable community and you don't need a car, more people are just more life on the streets, more potential friends, right? More help if you need to borrow a cup of sugar. Like, more people are naturally a good thing, which is like the way it ought to be. Like, you want people to come in your community to grow. Like, it ought to be that way. But instead, in these car-centric communities, it makes rational sense to fight to keep people out because of geometry. Everybody's got their house, everybody's got their car, and the more houses and cars you shove into a confined space, the more traffic and inconvenience and the less parking there is. And so it makes sense to fight new people. So my utopian community is a community where new people are welcomed because they enhance the community, which is just not something you can get with car-centric development. Sorry for that super extended rant.
Preaching to the choir. I mean, in urban studies terms, we just call that density, and
A terrible
it's
word.
good for
Okay, nope.
people. I mean, you emphasize that how humane it is, how human it is. It's also good for the environment, right? I
Yes.
mean, it is a crucial tool for climate change. But it seems like the aversion to it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the
Well,
fear and anxiety the people, the insecurity people have with people who are different from them, with losing kind of a sense of privacy or something like that.
well, you also can't, I mean, I can't let this discussion pass without bringing racism back into it. You cannot
Hmm.
overestimate the contribution of racism to the lack of social trust in the US and the way that shaped our land use development. White flight from the
Hmm.
cities, all this, it was fear and lack of social trust that led us to this sort of car-centric development. And it is the car-centric development that is reinforcing that fear and lack of social trust. Like,
Hmm.
everybody, once they get behind the wheel of a car, everybody basically becomes a sociopath, right? Like, you are out for yourself and everybody else is a competitor, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
so
It's behind our zoning laws, zoning codes,
yeah.
racism.
And it's
Yeah.
it's a self-reinforcing cycle again, which is so difficult to insert yourself into and try to turn it to get the other kind of cycle going, to sort of like get a few sidewalk cafes and then like people like them and like, or like New York City, like it was super controversial to close down Broadway or whatever that big street is they closed down to car traffic. It was super controversial, very difficult, took a lot of political courage, but now people love it and it's just going to be one increment easier to close the next street, right? Like, you got to get
Yeah.
the cycle moving in the other direction. It's very, very difficult. It's one of the most difficult things. But I really think that people underestimate the degree to which our inhumane land use policies, this sort of sprawl and car-centric development, shape Americans' mentality and their politics and their psychological sort of well-being. Like I just don't think we talk about that enough, and I think we underestimate it consistently.
Yeah. I think it's probably a good place for us to stop. I wanted to thank you both for doing this and just for your work in journalism, like your deep dives and the fact that you wrestle, I think, every day with that conflict, that tension between, like, let's rationally look at this issue, and the fact that the people who are going to be negotiating these issues are not always going to act rationally. And you're like, you just dive into that tension every single day, but it's super good. I mean, I love really wonky stuff anyway, but um, it's a service. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I would just say, if any students are out there listening to this and you have people around you telling you that it's useless or pointless to go into the humanities, I would just disagree strongly with that. My experience is that people who are capable of thinking clearly and communicating clearly are direly in need in every industry, in every walk of life. So the work you're doing, like absorbing complex material, boiling it down, learning how to explain it in your own words, learning how it connects to other things, all this stuff you do in humanities, super useful in the real world.
Thank you for that. That's the soundbite right there.
There you go.
All
Thanks, sir.
right. Thanks for talking to me, David.
Thanks a lot, Matt.